I am almost certain that anyone who saw a movie based on this story would consider it, to put it mildly, unbelievable, and there would be nothing surprising about that. After all, I too would never have believed in the reality of what happened if it were not for the vast amount of video evidence confirming the truth of this story. To grasp the spirit of this story, one must understand what the late 1960s to early 1970s meant for the USA. Primarily, it was a time of mass rallies and anti-government actions. What caused them? This was a unique period in history when one time frame encompassed several civil movements. Firstly, it was the movement for the rights of African Americans. In our time, this might seem ridiculous to many, but back then, it was indeed a huge problem, especially in the southern states. It reached the point of absurdity. For example, in Alabama, by law, a black person had to give up their seat to whites in public transport. There were separate establishments for blacks, and they were simply banned from entering many restaurants. Additionally, a large number of educational institutions boldly refused them admission solely based on skin color. This was not considered outrageous at the time because governors supported these ideas. As a result, since 1955, the black population held numerous rallies to gain the same rights as whites. Over time, sympathetic white people also joined the movement. Although by the early 1970s, African Americans had practically equal rights with whites, much of it was only on paper. For the same work, a white person and a black person could receive different pay. Therefore, the echoes of the struggle for black rights were still clearly heard. The second important civil movement was the so-called second wave of feminism. Yes, women had long since gained voting and property rights, but overall, building a successful career for a woman in those years in the USA was practically impossible. Women were still seen only as housewives, an appendage to a man. Many of them, when trying to find a job, faced sexual harassment from their employers, and they could do nothing about it. And, perhaps, the main movement of those years was the movement against the Vietnam War. The USA entered this conflict in 1964. Probably, the government thought it would quickly achieve victory, but no, it was not so. With each passing day, the number of soldiers killed increased, and the draft calls only grew and grew. The prospects of the USA winning this war seemed increasingly uncertain. Society openly did not understand why the USA needed this conflict, for what reason young people had to die. It is no surprise that in all the mentioned social movements, the driving force was young people, students, people aged 20 to 25. They grew up during the Cuban Revolution, grew up on films about Robin Hood and Zorro, stories of ordinary people standing against the government. In May 1970, Vermilion students went on strike. Young people openly burned their draft cards. At that time, more than 800 educational institutions were simultaneously closed in the USA. Students held large-scale rallies, and the police detained more than 20,000 people. But the culmination was the violence, the struggle between law enforcement and students. Probably the most vivid moment of that critical point was May 4, 1970. On that day, in the city of Kant, another peaceful student action was taking place, a protest against the Vietnam War, the invasion of neutral Cambodia, and the presence of the National Guard on the campus of a local educational institution. During the action, 28 National Guard soldiers fired more than 60 bullets at the students. 4 people were killed and at least 13 were injured. Of the 2 killed, they were not even participating in the protest. They were simply walking to class. This was the first, but far from the last, case of the death of anti-war protesters at the hands of law enforcement. Young people felt like those very Robin Hoods, patriots opposing a government that spit on the opinion of the people. Perhaps never before, as in the early 1970s, was America so close to revolution, a revolution whose main driving force was students. Probably, this is enough to understand the context in which this story took place. Now we can move on to its essence. On the evening of November 6, 1973, two men, Marcus Foster and Robert Blackburn, left school and were walking toward Foster's car. Suddenly, three people blocked their path. These individuals were armed, and a couple of shots rang out. Foster and Blackburn collapsed onto the asphalt, each bleeding profusely. A nearby patrol car arrived at the sound of gunshots. The attackers had already fled by this time. Foster and Blackburn were taken to the hospital. That same night, Foster died from his injuries. Blackburn managed to survive. The deceased man, Marcus Foster, was the superintendent of Oakland Unified School District, the first African American in the USA to hold such a position. Robert Blackburn was his assistant. At this stage, the police did not see an obvious motive for the crime. The main assumption was that it was a racially motivated crime. However, the police were wrong. They did not have to wait long for the correct answer. Just a couple of days later, the attackers openly declared themselves.
The SLA was not indiscriminately issuing death warrants for Foster, Blackburn, or anyone else. Such an attack was the only means left open to us to demand that the people's wishes be met and that all such dangerous genocidal programs be stopped.
Some newspapers in Oakland received letters in which an unknown group claimed responsibility for the death of Marcus Foster. The organization was called the Symbionese Liberation Army, abbreviated as SLA. The emblem of the group was a seven-headed cobra. The murder of Marcus Foster was a very high-profile crime covered by all the media. Probably, the goal was chosen to make the SLA abbreviation famous. A distinctive feature of the group was the modified bullets they used, each containing potassium cyanide, a very dangerous poison. Well, the group achieved its goal. After the murder of Marcus Foster, they indeed became known throughout America. The search for the attackers was conducted by both the police and the FBI, but unsuccessfully until January 10, 1974. On the evening of January 10, 1974, a lone van on the side of a road in Concord caught the attention of a patrolling officer. The officer approached the van, inside which were two men. The officer took their documents for inspection. After a couple of minutes, he ordered one of them to step out. The officer had just begun the search when suddenly the man abruptly turned and pulled out a revolver. A shootout ensued, with neither the man from the van nor the police officer aiming accurately. Unsurprisingly, neither hit the other. The officer quickly radioed for backup. Reinforcements arrived instantly, and the man in the van were surrounded. There was no point in continuing. There were so many police officers that resistance would have meant death. Those arrested were 24-year-old Russell Little and 26-year-old Joseph Ramiro. Weapons were found in their van, but most importantly, leaflets with the SLA emblem were discovered. This was a kind of propaganda material. One of the revolvers found with Ramiro was of the same caliber as the one used to kill Marcus Foster. They arrested Little, and Ramiro refused to provide any explanations. However, the police searched the area where the van was found. They discovered a half-burned house. Inside the house, they found weapons, revolutionary literature, and SLA propaganda materials. It was evident that not only Little and Ramiro were members of the group. Probably, when they were arrested and announced in the media, other SLA members realized that it was only a matter of time before the police found their hideout. Therefore, they set fire to the house they were living in and left. Unfortunately, they did not leave anything that could help the police track them down. The arrested Russell and Ramiro also continued to remain silent, so the group continued to successfully hide. At this stage, we need to move on to another story. One of the influential American families of those years, the Hearst name was associated with money and power. It became famous thanks to William Randolph Hearst, a media magnate. He owned a vast number of newspapers and magazines. He not only profited from them but also used them. After all, it is said that the press is the fifth estate. This was true for him. In the years when people got most of their information from newspapers, having a media empire was a great luxury. Politicians understood that public opinion about them was largely shaped by the press. This helped William Hearst gain influential friends in government circles, and thus, he became one of the most influential people in the USA. William Hearst's legacy was continued by one of his sons, Randolph Hearst. He also owned a large number of media outlets, just like his father, had enormous wealth and influential friends. What can I say? He was on a first-name basis with then-President Nixon. By 1974, Randolph Hearst had been married for over 20 years to a woman named Catherine. To many, she seemed cold and arrogant. Randolph and Catherine had 5 children, all girls. The eldest was Patricia, or simply Petty. By 1974, she was 19 years old. She was one of the students at the University of Berkeley. Her parents sensed her desire for independence, so it came as no surprise to them when, at 19, she decided to live with her boyfriend, Steve. Their romance began when Patty was 16 and Steve was 23. Both were connected to the University of Berkeley. Patty studied there, and Steve taught there. On the evening of February 4, 1974, Patty and Steve were at home. They lived in one of the apartments in the student housing complex. There was a knock at the door. Steve opened it slightly. A young woman stood at the door. She said she had probably damaged someone's car and asked to come in to make a phone call. Steve fully opened the door and instantly received a blow to the face. 2 men and a woman burst into the room. They were armed. They shouted, "Get down on the floor," face down. Terrified, Patty and Steve could not resist. Any attempt by Steve to lift his head resulted in a blow to the face. The armed individuals tied up Patty and gagged her with a gag. One of them started shouting at Steve, "Where is the safe? Where is your money?" Steve replied, "We don't have a safe. Take what you need and leave." He was telling the truth. There really was no safe in the apartment. One of them said, "They have seen our faces. We need to get rid of them." At that moment, Steve suddenly jumped to his feet and ran towards the exit. The attackers did not expect such agility. Steve ran to the nearest apartments, shouting and knocking on doors, but as expected, no one opened. It was evening. A wounded person shouting and knocking on your door. Most people would be scared in such a situation. Moreover, a couple of minutes later, there was the sound of automatic gunfire and a car quickly starting. Steve returned to the apartment, but neither the attackers nor his girlfriend Patty were there anymore.
They said absolutely nothing. They were very militaristic. They had it so well planned that they needed to say almost nothing to each other.
Of course, the kidnapping of the daughter of one of the most influential people in America instantly became the #1 topic in the USA. That same day, Randolph Hearst's home was surrounded by dozens, if not hundreds, of journalists. And not only journalists, the FBI took on the case that same day. And Hearst didn't even need to contact them. It was not Hearst who went to the FBI, but the FBI who came to him. However, even the FBI was powerless. Who were these kidnappers, and what did they want? The answer to this question was received on February 7, 3 days after the kidnapping.
The United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army, armed with cyanide-loaded weapons, served an arrest warrant upon Patricia Campbell Hearst. All communications from this court must be published in full in all newspapers and all other forms of the media. Failure to do so will endanger the safety of the prisoner. Should any attempt be made by authorities to rescue the prisoner or to arrest or harm any SLA elements, the prisoner is to be executed. And in capital letters under that is death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people.
The kidnappers were the group, yes, the very same one that killed Marcus Foster 3 months earlier. Many probably thought that the goal of the kidnapping was ransom, but no, it was not that simple. Their demands were unthinkable. They wanted to exchange the kidnapped girl for the 2 previously arrested members of the group, Russell Little and Joseph Ramiro. In such a situation, it is easy to say, we do not negotiate with terrorists. But not when it concerns your daughter. Now the ball was in the court of the powerful, Randolph Hearst and the government. However, even the influence Hearst had would not have been enough to convince President Nixon to agree to such an exchange. Probably, he himself understood the impossibility of such an exchange. But regardless of one's status, any father would at least try to do it. Well, all that was left was to wait and hope for the FBI. The FBI was completely at a loss, not knowing where to look, and they didn't even have an idea of the size of this group. However, later, the group itself realized that even such an influential figure as Randolph Hearst could not convince the government to make such an exchange. Therefore, on February 12, 9 days after the kidnapping, the SLA put forward new demands.
My name is Sin Q, and to my comrades I am known as Sin. I hold the rank of General Field Marshal in the United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Before any form of negotiation for the release of the subject prisoner be initiated, that an action of good faith be shown on the part of the Hearst family. This gesture is to be in the form of food to the needy and the unemployed, and to which the following instructions are directed to be followed to the letter.
Mom, Dad, I'm okay. I'm with a combat unit that's armed with automatic weapons. And these people aren't just a bunch of nuts. And they've been really honest with me that they're perfectly willing to die for what they're doing. And I want to get out of here, but the only way I'm going to is if we do it their way. And I just hope that you'll do what they say, Dad, and just do it quickly. And I mean, I hope that this puts you a little bit at ease, so that you know that I really am all right. I just hope I can get back to everybody really soon.
For the first time since the kidnapping, Catherine and Randolph Hearst heard their daughter's voice. She said that she was fine and that the kidnappers were treating her well. But who knows under what pressure this was said, the group demanded that every poor person in California receive food worth $70. The total cost of such charity would have amounted to approximately $250 million, which, accounting for inflation, is equivalent to about $1 billion today. Enormous money even for the Hearst family. Probably, the kidnappers greatly exaggerated Hearst's financial capabilities. Yes, he was very wealthy, but not to that extent. After all, he had 4 brothers, which means his father's money was divided into at least 5 parts. Even with all the desire, Hearst could not allocate so much money. Therefore, he made his offer to $1 million, which is equivalent to $12 million today.
Arrangements have been made for $2 million to be delivered to a tax-exempt charitable organization capable of making a distribution for the benefit of the poor and needy.
Dad, Mom, I'm making this tape to let you know that I'm still okay, and to explain a few things, I hope. I want them all to know that I'm okay, and to understand that I'll be okay as long as the SLA demands are met. I am being held as a prisoner of war, and not as anything else. I mean, and I'm being treated in accordance with international codes of war. And so, I mean, Dad, you shouldn't listen or believe what anybody else says about the way I'm being treated. This is the way that I am being treated. And it's really important that everybody understand that, I am an example and a warning. And because of this, it's very important to the SLA that I return safely. So people should stop acting like I'm dead, and Mom should get out of her black dress. That doesn't help at all. Try not to worry so much, and just do what you can, and I mean, I know you're doing everything. Let's take care of Steve, and just hurry. Bye.
That same day, preparations began for distributing food to the poor population. The program was named People in Need. Volunteers from other charitable organizations joined it. It should be said that the government was upset that Hearst was giving in to the kidnappers. In particular, the future president of the USA, then Governor of California Ronald Reagan, openly told the press, "I hope everyone who gets these free products gets botulism." However, the government's displeasure did not stop this program. In 16 locations across California, people formed huge lines to receive one of the 100,000 boxes of food. And at first, everything seemed to be going according to plan until a force majeure occurred at one of the distribution points. There were far more people who wanted to receive the products than expected. As a result, riots began at the food distribution point. The volunteers were scared and tried to leave the scene of the riots as quickly as possible. In their haste, they threw boxes of food directly into the crowd. Of course, from the outside, it looked terrible, and that was the scene the SLA members saw on television. Certainly, this was not the plan they had in mind.
The Hearst Empire has attempted to mislead the people and to deceive them by claiming to put forth a good faith gesture of $2 million. This amount is not at all a good faith gesture, but rather is an act of throwing a few crumbs to the people, forcing them to fight over it amongst themselves. The plan proposed by Mr. Hearst is not at all acceptable as a gesture of good faith in its present form. It shall be acceptable only if that an additional $4 million be added to the $2 million already allotted, making a total of $6 million to be used for the purchase of food. Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people.
On February 21, 17 days after the kidnapping, the group made new demands to distribute food worth another $1 million. As mentioned earlier, the government did not want Hearst to give in to the terrorists. But after all, this was his daughter. Many saw him scared for the first time, this strong man. However, despite this, he said the following.
I'd like to make a statement. The size of the latest demand of the SLA is far beyond my financial capability. Therefore, the matter is now out of my hand.
What does that mean, Mr. Hearst? What does that mean, sir?
Now we could only hope for the FBI and wait for the next step from the SLA. The FBI, however, was still no closer to the group. They used every available method to understand where the kidnappers might be holding Patty, analyzing every word, and even involving blind people, people without sight but with more acute hearing. The hope was that on the recording, they might hear something more, background noise that could help locate the girl. However, nothing helped.
Mom, Dad, I've received the message you broadcast last Sunday. It was good to hear from you after so much silence. Your silence has definitely jeopardized my safety because it allows the FBI to continue to attempt to find me and Governor Reagan to make antagonistic statements with no response from you. I don't know who influenced you to not comply with a good faith gesture. I know you could have done it the way the SLA asked. I know that we have enough money. I don't believe that you are doing everything you can, everything in your power. I don't believe that you're doing anything at all. You said that it was out of your hands. What you should have said was that you'd wash your hands of it.
On March 9, 34 days after the kidnapping, another tape from the SLA was received. The tape contained Patty's voice. It conveyed disappointment and perhaps even despair. After all, she, more than anyone else, understood what the people holding her were capable of. Did her father understand this? Most likely, yes. In his life, he had made many difficult decisions. However, the decision to refuse to give in to the SLA was probably the most difficult one in his life. One way or another, this decision cost him dearly, possibly much more than the $4 million he refused to pay. On February 15, 1974, the following recording was made at one of the branches of Hibernia Bank. It is not difficult to guess that the people in the video are members of the SLA group. They're both men and women in the footage, but one girl with a rifle stands out. The girl confidently and steadily keeps the hostages in her sights. This girl was Patricia Campbell Hearst, the 19-year-old student kidnapped 9 weeks earlier.